started, so I want to introduce you to Dr. Kelly Kent and Dr. Anne-Marie Seco. I met them 2 months ago now at the United States of Women Conference that was held here in LA at Shrine Auditorium at USC. It was an amazing event. I was just perusing the exhibitor area and was watching Anne-Marie give a demonstration of something you guys will see soon. But I will hand it over to them to talk to us about neuroscience, psychology, and workplace motivation.
All right. Okay, so I'm Kelly, and this is Anne-Marie, and I'll just set you up a little bit so you know how and why we ended up here, which is that we both went through the traditional academic path of getting our PhDs in neuroscience, and then did some research along the way and afterwards, and at a certain point, both independently of each other, but we found each other after the fact, where we had come to this realization that there's a really long turnaround in research in general, hitting the real world. And maybe you guys can relate actually with your work. So that turnaround can be so long, it can be a decade, it can be longer, it can be a little shorter, but the return on investment is long, and the thank yous are few and far between. And we wanted to really, in fact, our current commitment is that neuroscience can save the world. So we really wanted to bring it to everyday lives. And so we've been spending a long time doing that in education, and we do that a ton with teachers. We also talk to students themselves, but mostly adults, teachers, and we talk to parents. And now we're getting into the workplace culture, and so that's part of why we're here today. And we were exposing ourselves somewhat at that conference, and we've worked at a couple organizations so far, and we're building that out now. So we're going to talk about workplace culture today, and based on conversations and learning a little bit about where you are now and where you are potentially moving towards, we're going to talk about motivation. Okay? So we're going to start right away with an experiment, which means I need a volunteer. Where's my friend? Are you free right now? Because I can solicit someone else. Everyone's eager.
I can do it.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, and I actually should forget, your name is?
Alicia.
Alicia. Okay, so Alicia's going to come and help us up here. And this is what we did at the United States of Women, and so it might become immediately obvious why
Is this going to embarrass me though?
was drawn to us. It was
Because they're recording.
Okay, but I mean, it's not embarrassment like, you know, you won't be able to show your parents or something. It's, yeah. Okay. Toss underhanded at the target and just use your dominant hand, and it should be pretty straightforward. And of course, any one of you guys would be good. You can just, and any one of you would be able to do this, right? No big deal. In fact, it makes perfect sense because you've been on the planet a few decades, and you have no trouble doing this thing, right? So I'm going to put these on and make it a little more difficult. Do I have permission to put these goggles on? Yeah, okay. So, and then I'm going to hand you the target, the beanbags again, if I heard you. And do the same thing, okay? Everyone gotta support Alicia, right?
Do you know what this looks like anyone? Description or something, right?
Something. Yeah, something. Don't move around. Okay. We're going to support our colleague, right?
Yeah.
So as she...
Alicia! So I'm going to throw them?
Yeah. Same story, yeah.
Nailed it! Good job.
Okay, so what's happening? Somebody narrate for me. Go ahead, keep going. What's happening?
I'm trying.
She's off to the
Left.
She's off to the left. Okay. So
There you go.
no adjustment, right?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Nice.
Wow. What's your strategy right now?
Like I realized when I was throwing it directly,
Yeah.
it was going that way. So I like changed my target.
What's your target right now?
It's just like to the right.
Okay.
Target.
It's working, right? I mean, you're actually getting it so fast that I'm going to make you do it for a little bit longer. Otherwise, the rest of it won't work. Okay. Yeah. So let's do a solid 3 in a row.
I'm messing that. 3?
You're going to get it. We do this all the
Oh,
time.
you want me to hit it 3 times?
Yeah,
in a
3
row?
times in a row. 1, 2. Oh my goodness! Don't do it too fast.
Sorry.
Does that count? No.
2.
3-ish.
I don't know.
Oh, there's one.
Okay, we will let you go after these last two.
There you go.
Okay, so now don't take them off, and I'm gonna let you do this one more time, but I'm gonna remove the goggles. The second I remove it, you're gonna go again.
Okay.
Ready, and go.
Oh, gosh. This is.
Are you driving home today?
So cool.
Alicia, I'm trying.
A little bit more, because we gotta make sure you're straight.
Okay.
Very good.
It's bad.
Does it feel normal?
Yeah, it's better.
It's better? A few more? You good?
Yeah.
Okay, you look good. Okay, thank you, Alicia. All right, so we had a little narration in the beginning, but what happened, if you guys can just pipe in? And also throughout the presentation, jump in. I will be soliciting answers from you at various points. So what happened? So she was off to the right, to the left, and then what happened?
She found her new target and was able to do it.
Mhm. Okay, and she takes the goggles off. What did it feel like, by the way?
When I took them off.
In general, when you put them on?
Oh, mine, it was like, the vision was different. And then when we took them off, I felt like I was like, oh my gosh, something else new. And then I had to adjust.
Okay, so when she takes them off, what happens?
Readjust.
Yeah, so what's going on there? Why is that occurring? So she's been practicing throwing straight in front of her whole life, right? Which is a long time, relatively speaking, right? So what was going on that she was able to just within seconds, really, adjust and get on that target with those goggles on? How was she able to do that? I mean, kids don't learn to throw balls in seconds. So what was going on there? What allowed her body to make that adjustment, the series of adjustments?
We were like telling her.
Okay, that's an interesting point, right? So you're getting some auditory feedback. In fact, how did she know, how did her brain know that she missed the target?
She didn't hear the sound of it hitting.
The sound, the visual feedback, right? Okay, so she's getting auditory feedback from her peers. Also, you know, she starts to make some changes in her motor program, right? As she's noticing that she's off and her brain is helping her make these adjustments. So very quickly she adapts, right? So what's this phenomenon called in the brain? Somebody said it earlier today when we were walking around.
Plasticity.
Oh yeah, it was you. That's why I chose you. Right, so we've got this incredible flexibility of the brain that's able to adjust, and it's a really notable ability. Like, we actually have to sit and let it sink in for a minute, because why is it there in the first place? Why do we need to be able to adjust to something so really preposterous? It was ridiculous. Do you need to be able to do that to function in this world? No, but your brain was able to. Why would that be? Why would your brain be capable of adjusting to something so radically different than your experience so far on this planet? And why would that be helpful?
Back to danger.
Well, conditions are always changing, so you need to be able to adapt to a changing environment to survive.
Yeah. Flexibility is really important for survival, right? If you could only function with the one scenario that you were born into, we wouldn't have survived as a species. And actually, it's also important to think about it in terms of where we are culturally and technologically as a species, because our genetic material has not changed very much over our evolution, you know, since leaving the continent of Africa and so forth. We've had relatively little genetic adaptation, but we've had profound cultural and technological adaptations, and yet our brain can adjust, right? Our brain can adjust and understand what usually we'll have like a red ball with spikes on it, plastic red ball. But why would your brain even understand and be able to comprehend what a red plastic spiky ball is, when certainly that wasn't around when we were evolving as a species, right? So we have this incredible plasticity. So then she takes the goggles off and she adjusts right back, but it takes time. Why is there that delay? Why was there the delay where she was off to the right for the first few throws?
Is to retrain the memory.
Right. So what actually occurred when she had those goggles on and was successfully hitting the target a few times in a row? What do we call that?
Muscle memory?
It's plasticity, you said it, but in a classroom we would call that. What do you do in classrooms?
Learning.
You learn, right? That was learning. And so taking it off, we also had to unlearn it. That same phenomena, and they're not that different from each other in terms of what, and that is an acute kind of plasticity, and it all takes place via the brain's primary cell type, which is called the what? Does anyone know? Oh, that's my daughter. Always fear for the children of neuroscientists. What's the primary cell type in the brain called?
Neuro.
Yes. Okay, so if we zoom in on this big homogeneous 3-pound lump, we will find a whole bunch of these, and they're not really in cartoon color, but they do have this very funny shape. And why do they? And for those of you who know this stuff, please continue to answer the questions for me. Why do neurons have this crazy shape? Does it look like a typical cell to you? What's weird about it? What does it look like? When you think of a cell, you think of, go ahead.
Keep growing.
Yeah. I mean, what keeps growing?
You constantly learning, absorbing.
Yeah, you're getting where I'm going. So why is the cell this funny shape?
So she has lots of connections.
Yes, so it can make lots of connections, right? Because when we think of cells, we think of circles, we think of spheres, we think of flat, maybe squarish type cells, but nothing this wacky. And it's really important to let that part sink in, because that's the crux of where the magic happens in the brain and where learning actually occurs. Because all of these jammies, these little projections, are called dendrites, and they are there to make new connections with the neighboring cells, right? And so when we're learning, we are actually causing changes at this spot right here, which is called the synapse. And the synapse is a gap. It's not a thing that you touch, but it's a space in between the cells, and in between those two cells is fluid, and across the fluid, things like neurotransmitter cross. And of course, you're familiar with neurotransmitters because it would be dopamine, all the things that we take for, psychotropics, medications, food, etc., will be affecting levels of neurotransmitters in between those two neurons. We have an electrical signal within and a chemical signal between. And translating the signal from electrical to chemical at that synapse and back to electrical in the next neuron is a totally cool biological truth that I recommend looking up on YouTube, because there are tons of really cool animations about it. It's a very fun neuroscience topic to learn about. Okay, so as Alicia's getting better at throwing with the target, she's got this very acute plasticity happening. It's probably in the type that is at the neurotransmitter level, chemical changes, because the other kind is a more permanent change. What's the difference between these two neurons on the left and the neurons on the right?
The right side is more connected.
Right, and that's a physical change, right? We can measure that, we can touch it, we can see it in a microscope, right? So when we're talking about long-term learning, which is the type we really care about, and in fact, we got brought here by XPRIZE Adult Literacy, and so when we were thinking about talking to you guys, we were thinking about learning in that sense, right? That's the kind of learning that we would want from adults who are learning to read, right? Is the kind where you can see a change in the brain of that human being, right? If you were to dissect their brain, which we're not going to do. But if we were, we would see that sort of change, as opposed to what Alicia was doing, which is about flexibility in our environment. That's the kind of change that we experience when we think we're going to take a step and there's no step there, right? So how do we protect ourselves from falling? And why is it important that we protect ourselves from falling in that moment, right? Think about what happens. You go to take a step, your foot gets feedback that there's no step there. It has to send information back up to the brain. That's a long distance. The brain has to readjust and send out a new motor program, all in time for you to not fall and crack your head open. Why is it important for you to not fall and crack your head open? Survival matters. Why?
It's a pretty existential question.
Right?
Just say procreation.
So So procreation, right? If we don't go the existential route, if we stick with the biology, it's about we cannot pass on. And the only reason I drag us through these things that we learned about at one time, but I want us to review, is because it's important to understand that we are necessarily the version of the human species that can adapt to a change in our ground surface and not die, because those that did die didn't pass on their genetic material. So we are descendants of the ones that had flexible learning capabilities, okay? All right, so the kind of learning that we care about and think about is this kind that takes place in terms of material tissue. We do not any longer, as neuroscientists, question that this is true. We absolutely know that it exists in humans and in all mammals and lots of species all over the planet. And we've seen that these studies show this in all sorts of really wacky things, including circus performers. There are lots of really well-known studies in musicians that I'm sure have come across your table, especially in kids. When they learn music over a lengthy period of time of development, they get these big giant corpus callosum, which is that area of white matter trapped in between the two hemispheres. And it makes a lot of sense because kids they're not white. See, your 3D brains don't break open, do they? So, but we could make them, 3D printer brains. So the corpus callosum, of course, gets really big because if you think about what the kids are doing, they're using both their hands, they're crossing the midline, they're reading, they're remembering, they're listening, they're doing all sorts of things all at the same time. So it makes a lot of sense. Anyway, so we see tons and tons and tons of studies that make us know without a doubt, not only are we very plastic in general, but we are very plastic throughout our lifetime. Okay? So there are windows of development that are important to take advantage of. That being said, we are always plastic. We are indefatigably plastic, and the way to stay cognitively sharp into your old age is to continue to challenge yourself the way such that it hurts. You have to make yourself uncomfortable. We now understand this. The way you can tell the difference between people who are 80 and who are sort of declining, we all know them, and the people who are 80 who are really sharp as a whip, is the people who are 80 who are sharp as a whip, if you control for all other factors, socioeconomic status, et cetera, is that they do things that are uncomfortable every day. If they need to learn a new athletic pursuit, every day. If they need to learn a new language, immersive. If they need to, et cetera, it has to hurt. You do it till it hurts, and then you still do it a little bit more, and then you finally stop, right? So we are always plastic. And of course, medical students who are studying for their boards. All right, so I've talked to you about how we have individual control over our brains. And of course, that isn't the whole story, right? Because that would be all things being equal in a utopian society where we have all the resources that we need. We can just practice and practice and practice and get better with effort. But you need certain things to be able to make that happen, of course, right? You need access, you need time, you need resources. Very importantly, you need mentoring. So this is why socioeconomic status does actually really matter for learning, right? Because you cannot have access to mastery if you don't have, in particular, mentorship, right? Someone who can tell you where to do the practice, because mindless practice is not the same as mindful practice, right? Like what if you are practicing the thing that you already know really well, because of course that's easy for you and you enjoy it, but you need a mentor to guide you and say, listen, here's the place that you really need to do the work because you're struggling there, right? So all of these things matter, and they point to this bigger question of it's not just us as individuals having control over our ability to learn and be plastic with practice, but the culture has a profound impact on our brain as well. And our environment has a profound impact on our brain as well. And I'll tell you a story to kind of represent that. So Robert Sapolsky is this neuroendocrinologist, and he studies baboons in Kenya. And he was following this one troop for 3 generations or something, third, I don't know, a really long time, decades of work. And the baboons are hierarchical in nature, so they have alpha males and then the next subset of males and then the females and so forth. And the alpha males are really nasty and they're spitty and bitey and hissy and just not cool. And they also eat first. And that, and the other subsets of both males and females are very pro-social, and you can measure that by the amount of grooming that they do of each other. And so one year, the alpha males got access to a tuberculosis-laden batch of meat from a dumpster, and the entire alpha male subset died. So he's watching this troop for a really long time. He's devastated. He's lost them. He also had bonded with them despite their nastiness. And he wonders what's going to happen. He's lost all this data, but also it's an opportunity. So what do you think would fill in that void of the alpha male subset? If you were supposed to, what would you predict?
The next subset.
Yeah, and that they would adopt these nasty behaviors, right, that are traditional of the alpha males. So on the contrary, it finds that, yes, the next subset of males comes in and becomes alpha in that they are ruling the troop, but they're very pro-social still. And so he can measure this by the grooming and by the other behaviors. And what's fascinating is that he's watched them, Google it, look it up, you will find it. He's watched them over generations, and this has maintained throughout not only multiple generations of new males coming along and maintaining a pro-grooming social infrastructure, but also baboons have this thing where when they become adolescents, they leave their own troop and they move to another troop to become an alpha male. So interlopers would arrive at this pro-social troop and try to be kind of mean and nasty and gnarly, and they would get ostracized by the pro-social males in this troop. So it is still the case that there's this exceptional troop in Kenya that is very pro-social and kind, and it was very radical for the behavioral people watching because they thought this was an immutable truth, it's hormones, right? They thought that it was absolutely defined by nature and could never be messed with. But actually we find that culture's impact on our biology is so profound that it can even impact something like that, right? So that's ultimately why we're here, is to talk about workplace culture and to talk about it's both, right? We are influencing our brains' potential, but also our culture has this profound impact on our brains and therefore our productivity and our happiness, etc., and our creativity. All right, so that's why we're here today, and we are talking about motivation. And so I just wanted to start with a question, and I'm going to hand it over to Anne-Marie in just a minute. I want to start with a question about this young woman who's standing at the bottom of these steps, and she's got this big old heavy backpack on. And what's happening, and why is she there?
Exploring.
Yes. Totally gave away my punchline.
Oh,
Yeah. So yes. Why? What if there's something life-threatening up there?
Why not?
But what if you could die?
Who cares? You're experiencing life.
So why is that motivating?
The unknown.
Yeah. So yes, and intuitively, I think as humans, we can relate, right? But it turns out that there's a biological sense to that. And so let's talk about it a tiny little bit. That unknown is exactly what we want to talk about with this first piece of motivation. Because motivation has a really big relationship with dopamine. What do you know about dopamine? Do you guys know about dopamine? Okay, go ahead. Just give it to me. Yeah, you said it.
The feel-good chemical.
Happiness.
Like the workout.
Uh-huh. Okay. So it's the reward neurohormone, neurochemical, yeah. So it's like the sex, drugs, and rock and roll neurotransmitter. It's what's released in our brain to say, yes, do that again, right? Because you have to be rewarded for having sex. Why?
Or else you won't do it.
You have to do it again, right? You have to procreate, and you have to enjoy eating because you have to survive, right? And then drugs, famously hijack this system and confuse the brain into thinking, oh, this is essential for your survival, when actually it's the opposite. Yes. Okay. So we've got this chart here because I wanted to point out that what we know about dopamine is that it's a kind of a popular myth that it's the reward neurochemical because as you can see, I have this showing us that if dopamine's up on this axis and time is on this bottom axis, if we talk about it in terms of like a rat that has been taught to press a lever, and when he presses the lever, he gets juice, right, which is his reward, and we're actually listening to dopamine neurons in the brain fire, and they fire releasing dopamine, right? So the first few times that rat learns to push the lever for juice, it releases dopamine in the brain, and we hear those neurons fire on an amplifier, and it sounds like pop, 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 pop. And then one day, those neurons are still being recorded, and all that happens is the technician enters the lab, and then the neurons go firing like crazy. Pop, 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 pop. Why?
Because they've learned that the technician gives it to them.
Yeah, it's anticipation, right? It's that Pavlov's dog thing. But biologically speaking, this is a big deal because it means that in terms of the neurochemicals in the brain, when we have the highest level of dopamine, and therefore it can be interpreted as the most rewarding phase, is during the work. It's during the anticipation, right? This is where the motivation conversation is coming in. And it's actually during that work that you're experiencing the most reward and reinforcement, and the brain is learning, do this again, it's good for your survival. And it's once you already have the reward that that is no longer important, right? When it's novel, the first time you learn to press the lever for juice, you get a big reward. But after that, the main purpose of dopamine is to get you to do the slogging of the work, right? Because otherwise, why would you work so hard? Think about that, evolutionarily speaking. Like as a species, to get up and explore, even when you may not find something that can feed you that day, and get up and again the next day and explore, you have to be willing to do that work, right? Okay, so that makes some sense. But then we also find out that if you make the reward intermittent, so it's maximally unpredictable, so 50% of the time you don't get the juice and 50% of the time you do get the juice, the reward in terms of dopamine in your brain, so this is when you were getting the juice 100% of the time you push the lever, and this is when you're getting the juice only 50% of the time, and it's super unpredictable, the dopamine levels are through the roof, right? So what does this have to do with the girl climbing the stairs?
It's unpredictable.
Yeah. It's unpredictable, but also there is a potential for what?
Great reward. Great reward.
Yes, absolutely, and failure, right? When something's unpredictable and exploratory, it is necessarily also has as part of it the chance of failure, right? This chance of success and failure are equal. This is really important in learning environments, all learning environments, right? For children and for adults. And so we use the metaphor of the surfer, because if you think about a surfer, I feel like it's such a good, I mean, are any of you surfers? Crazy people. Like, it's freezing, there's sharks, you're always gonna fall, you know?
The sharks aren't.
Not here, maybe. But, you know, and they go out and they go at ungodly hours. I mean, it just seems so unattractive. Why would you do that? But they do it over and over and over again. There's something really motivating about it. And I'm sure you fall a lot, right?
Yeah. But I will say, there's an interesting study you should check out about sea spray.
Okay, that's
and about the chemicals it releases in your brain. So you can
sea spray is the waves?
No, it's after the wave. The wave hits,
Okay.
sea spray comes up, the
Oh.
ions that you get from that gives you this
No way.
euphoric feeling.
That's awesome.
And you get super into it. So it's not just the motivating factor of like, there's actually a really interesting study, I think you guys will enjoy it if you want to use this
Cool.
example
Yeah.
about surfing. Because I looked it up recently because it just makes you so happy. Like,
Yeah.
you've never experienced this level of happiness without
Do you concur?
without your drugs. You know what I mean? So it's pretty cool.
It's also great for your hair.
Yeah.
Okay, so, you know, we just use these guys as a metaphor for finding the sweet spot, right? And, you know, I think one of the things that we have come to understand about the culture here is that there is this effort to really promote the idea of, hey, you know what, you may not necessarily need a directive to start something new, and that experimentation, exploration, that culture of exploration is going to necessarily have some potential for failure in it, right? But the more there is the potential for failure, the more your brain is going to be rewarded and therefore motivated. And there's another aspect of that that is really positive. So this is talking about it again in terms of the biology. We have these two mice. They're genetically identical. They get put in two separate cages, but they're identical and they're in identical spaces. And then some imperceptible change in the environment leads one mouse to explore just a smidgen more than the other, right? Just the tiniest little bit. But it turns out that exploration, because it's rewarding biochemically, begets more exploration, right? Because it's telling you do it again, it's good for your survival. And so it's a feed-forward process. The mouse that explores is rewarded and explores more, right? And necessarily, the more curious you are and the more exploring you're doing, if we draw that out to humans, means the more creating you're doing and the more producing you're doing, right? And it's all biochemically rewarding. And then, yeah, if we look at it at the human level, the whole reward system was set up to teach you to do it again for the sake of survival. It also, because it's a neurotransmitter being released at the synapse, is enhancing what? Quite literally, that we talked about at the very beginning. What's happening to your neurons if you have neurotransmitter release and those two neurons are having more conversations with each other, and so they're growing and what? Yeah, you're getting more connections and you're having more plasticity. So you are also quite literally learning and growing new material in your brain, right? And there's a cool study that sort of talks about how this happens, where this guy in a pottery classroom separates the pottery, these are adults, into two groups, and half of them are given the assignment for the semester. You have to produce one final excellent wheel product, and you're going to be graded on the quality of one product. And the other half is said, you need to produce as many possible wheel products as you can, and you'll be graded on your quantity, okay? And the two groups do that, and at the end of the semester, the teacher grades them on quality as well as quantity, right? So he told them he was going to grade one on quality and the other on quantity, but then he actually looks and sees who produces the best product. Who produces the best product?
Quantity.
Quantity. Why?
Say experimented.
Because they've iterated. They've iterated, they've failed, they've messed up. Not only are they practicing that entire time, they're practicing that entire time, so they're learning that entire time, but there's also this biological piece that you attach to it and a little bit of other behavioral evidence that when you make a mistake that is close to the correct answer, you learn more than without having made the mistake at all. So we know all sorts of biology about why mistakes are really important for learning, but in terms of telling this story, the iterating is in and of itself this really incredible opportunity for production, for good product, right? So that's why the failure is this really important workplace culture. So I'm gonna, before we turn it over to Anne-Marie, I wanna give you, if you don't mind, just like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, to, if you'll write down on this piece of paper, come up with like 3 or 5 things. What do you have to do tomorrow? What do you have to do the next day? What's this week? What's your deadline this week? 3 or 5 things that are your projects.
Or 20.
Yeah, whatever you want, but just take a couple minutes. Write down, like we have done examples up here that we came up with. Identify funders, communications with marketing, blah, blah, blah. Whatever your deadlines and projects are, name them. And then just right next to it, how likely is it to succeed or fail? Do you guys understand that second part? In the second column, give it a number from 1 to 5. How likely is that assignment of yours to succeed or fail? Got it? Go, 2 minutes. Anyone else need pens?
So this is just for inspiration up here. What are these things in here?
I know.
Are they like the smart boards? Decent amount of people looking, some there are more than one. Okay, give me 1 minute.
Dave, you wanna play?
Yes.
Okay, so finish up, and then the intent of this worksheet is also for you guys too. We only have 60 minutes, and I think in a more ideal setting, we would workshop the worksheet with you and kind of have you guys work on it in groups. But we'll just put it out there for now, and hopefully you guys can make something of it after the session or within your teams, who knows?
We're gonna come back to it too at the end.
And we are going to use it again at the second portion of when we get into motivation. And so leave that for a minute. We're going to come back to it because this next part is really where we think that we can maybe contribute to what you're already doing well. So I was sort of trying to paint a picture of what I understand to be a workplace culture that at least is being promoted here, that is something that the workplace is committed to. And now I want to add to that, where can we think about our motivation personally and in terms of real engagement. And I have this picture up here because these people are doing crazy things. I keep saying that about the surfer, but I would never jump from that cliff. And so I have to think when I look at those women, what in God's name? Why?
What about when you were 20?
Maybe, I don't know, but maybe. I did crazy things. But so what is it that gets them to make that jump, right? It's not just their age or impulsivity or something, right? So when we get to the place where it's a real slog, where we really can't break through, right? Where the stakes are super high, just that piece about a culture that embraces failure may not be enough, right? That's what I want to now hand over to Anne-Marie. What do we do then? There's something that needs to get us to this place where we can take the leap, where even when the stakes are really high, we can take that leap.
Okay, and just before we start off, I actually want to tell you that I did jump off something like this a few times, and actually one was at a bridge. I grew up in Illinois, and it was a 60-foot bridge, and then again on the coast of somewhere Greek island. I was very young, but the reason I did it was because none of the women would jump off, only the men, and I was like, I have to take one for the team.
Representation.
There you go.
This is the side. So it was basically because I wanted to show everyone that they can do these types of things. Anyway, that was a side story. So I'm actually going to talk now about the emotional centers of the brain. So why do the emotional centers of the brain matter for workplace engagement? Someone tell me. Where's my star girl science student? Teamwork? Certainly. Let's go a few levels even further down though. And I'm going to get to that point shortly.
Can you repeat the question?
Why do the emotional centers of the brain matter for the workplace environment?
They drive what we actually do.
Because
They're more compelling at times than logic,
and why are they more compelling?
because you get dopamine hits from
Things that make you happy. So yes, we do get dopamine, and these neurotransmitter systems are interwoven interwoven, that's the word I want. But really the answer lies in our evolutionary history. So we like to use the metaphor of a family buying a starter home when we talk about the human brain. And then instead of knocking down that knocking down that house, as their family grows and they need more space, they add more rooms, they add a second floor, they add a pool. And the metaphor is that the original house was the more primitive brain that is what we find in a lot of these evolutionary distant animals, such as lizards and chickens and other very simple, more simple organisms. And so what that means is that in this, upgraded home, which can do a lot more things and house a lot more people, has more space, we actually have the same foundation and the same walls as the original house. Make sense? Everybody with me? And so that means that the foundation on which our human brain rests is very similar to that of a more primitive animal. And so we like to ask people, what would a more primitive animal actually be worried about? What does a lizard think about and do all day long?
Hunt.
Okay, so feeding,
Eating.
Warm, yeah.
hot and cold looking, yes. Doesn't fit into my joke, but
Not being
I'll work with
eaten,
it.
staying away from being eaten.
right, fighting, fleeing, right? Right, and so these more primitive animals really have what we call the 4 Fs, which is feeding, fleeing, fighting, and mating. And that's what and so we have these exact same centers, right? We have a whole lot of other amazing stuff in our brain, but we still have these same centers in our brain as well. And so this brain is cool. You probably heard the lizard brain, right? And actually, the structure that is most often referred to is this tiny little almond-shaped structure we have on both sides. We have 2 brains, essentially, in our head called the amygdala. The amygdala is just the Latin word for almond. And it's tiny. And when you tell people that all of their negative emotions really reside in these tiny little almond-shaped structures, you either feel empowered or very, very small. Okay, because so tiny. And this too, the amygdala is really important for survival. And it's really important for telling us where danger is. There is a subset of the amygdala that's much less well studied that we think is more involved in appetitive or from the word approach or from the word satisfying or appetite, or more positive emotions as well. But because that's been studied less, a lot of times we hear more about the fear-based role of the amygdala. And the fear-based role of the amygdala is super, super, super powerful. So anybody in here who or knows somebody who's experienced a phobia knows how strong this little bundle of cells can be, right? And why is it so strong again? Why is it so important?
Survival.
Survival, absolutely. And so I think a lot of that is fairly intuitive for most of you. You've probably heard, about the fight or flight response and stress response throughout most of your life. What's less intuitive is that the amygdala is actually involved in what we would consider a more cognitive or rational or algorithmic task. So you guys are looking at this formula up here, and if I had each one of you in an fMRI scanner, which is a way just to see the activity in your brain, all of you would have some amygdala activation. Wouldn't be nearly as big as if I had that lion up here or someone pointing a gun up here at you, but you all have amygdala activation. Why? Because it's wrong. It's wrong. And things being wrong, are they important for your survival?
Yes.
Perhaps, yeah, in a slightly indirect way. I mean, maybe if you need to kill 5 deer and now you've got 4, you might not feed so many. But the point is here that there is no task, there is no idea, there is no rational thought that is not grounded in emotion and tied to our survival. So everyone is with me on that. Okay, so we also have this incredible area of the brain that allows us to feel the emotions and intentions of others, right? And this is an extremely powerful system. I'm going to explain it in just a second, and very quickly because it's a long, drawn-out story. But why would it be important for our survival that I can recognize what so-and-so is feeling at that moment?
Because then you can read the situation and figure out if you need to be feeling the same way or not.
Certainly that's part of it, yeah. There is a personal survival element, or, is that guy slow, so as long as I run, he'll be the eaten one type thing. But I was actually looking at the more hopeful version of that. But humans are social animals, and one of the reasons we are is that we have succeeded as a group because we work well together. Like, we do better as a group, right? Survival of the human species is more likely when we have human members that care about each other and look out for each other. And so we have these subsets of circuits in the brain called mirror neurons. And these mirror neurons, part of them are motor, meaning if I start going like this, every single one of you watching me right now is having a pattern of activation in your motor cortex, which is responsible for movement, that is activating like you are moving your arm like I am, even though you're not. Right? That's pretty far out, think about that. And it's actually a different group of neurons than if I were actually to start making a punching motion, even though it's a very similar extension of the arm. This was a really foundational discovery in a lab in Italy with monkeys, but we'll talk about it another time. And then none of you have to be convinced that we actually also have areas of the brain that respond for the affective aspect of sociality, meaning every single person in this room has felt the pain and joy of another. In fact, we often feel the pain and joy of a made-up character on TV. This system is that strong, right? And so this system, again, is what helps us survive, because not only can we understand the importance of the feelings and intentions of others, this is also now linked to our survival, because the survival of our group is important for the survival of the species. And so, of course, that's why. So we came in here with the lens of adult literacy. But any picture up and down that wall could go up here, right? Because everything that we are doing is to further, in this company, is to further and push mankind and improve lives for people and innovate. And so this is biologically rewarding because it is based in survival. Now, sending 1,000 emails every day to get these things to happen, is that always biologically rewarding? No. And so what we're here to do, and part of it is, to help you as personally see how you can leverage some of this engagement from the level of survival, very powerful engagement, to develop what we call intrinsic motivation. And so behaviorally, intrinsic motivation is extremely powerful, and I have one last experiment to tell you about, which is from a branch of the military, and I'm always forgetting which one. West Point France. It's a duck rest. Okay. Which is so they followed a group of people who entered the armed forces. And the psychologists wanted to know what would predict the quickest and largest rise of rank. And so the nice thing about the military is that you can actually look at performance by just looking at rank. It's more complicated in the corporate setting because companies are different sizes, making different roles. But you can see that pretty clearly in the Army. And so they surveyed and they asked all of these groups of soldiers as they entered some basic questions. Why are you here? Is it because you love what you're doing, you think it's important, it's aligned to your personal mission, which we'll call intrinsic motivation? Is it because you want the fame, the fortune, the money that would come from a high status position in the military? That's what we call extrinsic motivation. Or is it some combination of the two? So they followed them for about 10 years, and they looked at who had moved up many ranks in the military. What do you think they found?
Intrinsic. Intrinsic motivation was more powerful.
More powerful than those that had some of both?
Probably not, but weighing slightly in favor of that one, the other would probably be good.
Did I skip that? Did I not say some of both?
No, you didn't.
I did. Okay, so yes, you were actually the first person that's ever answered that correctly, but so maybe I've been driving the point. Normally people say, oh, those that have some of both, right? So why not have a little bit of both types of motivation? And realistically, most of us have that, right? There are not just intrinsic motivators that get us to work every day. But those that have the strongest intrinsic motivation move the most up through the ranks in the military. Okay, and so that's the type of motivation that we want to build culturally. And if we have this motivation culturally, and our brains are social, and our brains are plastic, what can happen when we have this as a culture? Our brains change to rewire. I mean, this is the large-scale network rewiring, but your brains will change to develop this type of motivation. I'm sure that most of you in this room, if not all of you, already have a lot of that. That's why you're here at this amazing company. But culture matters, and our brains can change and become even more intrinsically motivated when the right settings occur. So we're going to come back now to our handout, and we're going to have you just list a number of personal values. Again, these are, don't overthink this because it's a rabbit hole. So just jot down whatever comes to your mind quickly. This is something you can reflect on more later with your team or at home. But we're now going to try to help you align some of the everyday tasks that you have to do every day with some of your personal values. I want to understand that. Actually, and then we'll go ahead and do the next 2 questions on the back. Let's just do it all together and then talk, and we'll go back.
So break down a few of your values, like, no,
No.
yours.
Your own values.
Is it trustworthiness, is it, yeah, gluttony, justice, And do you guys see that there's instructions there to, if you can, for a few of them, correspond values to any of the tasks you wrote in the table earlier,
There you go.
if possible. This may not be something you can do right this second. We want to sort of get you thinking about it. But if you can align values to some of your tasks, it would be helpful for our conversation.
You're looking perplexed.
Oh, no, I was just saying, I'm looking at the example and how you associate personal values to responsibility. It's not hard.
Yeah.
It is hard.
And it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be really hard. So, and it's okay if you're not able to do it right now. It's because we're basically gonna kind of make the challenge that where personal values are not tied to your tasks, you have room to grow, and that it's something maybe to put your mind to. So go ahead and turn over now, and look at those top 2 questions. The bottom half of the handout is less about today and more about saying, these are some of the things we like to kind of talk to people about. But look at those top 2 questions and kind of give them a minute, think about them. Do you have any answers that come to mind? Could you connect them with what we're talking about? What would you choose to do if you had nobody telling you what to do tomorrow?
Well, we're keeping
It's a good
this work
question,
related.
right? And And what would you avoid if you could? You know, and you, keep these to yourselves. Just whatever you- Okay, so let me bring you back with kind of a driving it home summary idea. You know, if the idea is, well, we're trying to promote a work culture where we can iterate and fail and come up with maybe some of our own ideas and try to see them out. That part seems to be really brain aware. But if we're also trying to expand upon our work culture of motivation, perhaps a place to grow is around our emotional centers of the brain, right? And to understand the incredible asset that we are taking advantage of when we are engaging around values, right? Because our emotional centers are so intimately tied with our cognitive centers. They were never meant to be separate. It's a myth that we have the rational brain and the emotional brain, right? If you were going to remember the circuitous route back from the ripe field of berries that you discovered when your tribe was starving, would you have remembered it if you weren't almost panicked that your tribe would starve? Of course not. Learning has always been tied to emotions. If you didn't give a crap about the lion at the watering hole, would you have passed on your genetic material? Of course not. Learning not to go to the watering hole at 2 p.m. or when the sun is at that spot in the sky because the lion is there means that you were able to pass on your genetic material. We are necessarily descended from those where learning and emotions are so intimately tied that we now know that the things we do best are the things that we are most emotionally engaged in. So how can we challenge ourselves to think about that? Think about it through the worksheet, think about it as teams. Where are our values aligned with our work and where aren't they? And how can we push on that a little bit and even get uncomfortable with it in conversations with supervisors, with up and down, you know. How can we think about the work that we are being asked to do and that we want to do and figure out how to align it to values or figure out ways to delegate, automate, etc. And then we have lots of ideas that we would love to come back and talk to you about along those lines. But as homework, how can you guys start having this conversation? Do you have a question?
I did. So you talked about in the military example about how having a culture that rewards certain where people see the benefits of being motivated by certain intrinsic motivations, and if you establish a culture that rewards that and encourages that, then it can sort of continue to grow. Are there corresponding evidences that show that there are things that a company can do or that management can do that will cause those who are motivated by those intrinsic motivations to become less motivated by them and kind of lose the value of those motivations if management acts in certain ways?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're about to launch into a whole other
we can talk
sphere
about
of material, and it's really interesting stuff. But yeah, I mean, it does work both ways, and you can kill really naturally wonderful intrinsic motivation. There's plenty of opportunity for that, unfortunately.
There's a really interesting study in preschoolers where they see 5 preschoolers who like to draw. And so they decide then that the preschoolers who like to draw, they're going to give them awards for drawing. So they start giving them awards, which are just a sheet of paper with a big shiny gold thing on it. And so then they, log the number of minutes they draw spontaneously after they've gotten a big shiny piece of paper. Do you think they draw less or more? Less. So there's some danger with some of these extrinsic rewards. Now, we're not saying that we shouldn't compensate employees well and give them all sorts of perks and support them so that they can be whole individuals and healthy and all those things, so that we don't want anyone taking the message the wrong way, stop giving people money. But there are ways in which you can, so intrinsic and extrinsic motivation actually are somewhat antagonistic, unfortunately. And especially in creative endeavors, there's a whole body of research that suggests that extrinsic motivators like money especially can decrease creativity. But again, it doesn't mean that we don't pay employees well. Pay them well, so they don't have to worry about that. But there is a whole bunch of other incentives that are monetary.
Well, and one thing I was speaking about with Janine is that she has the opportunity to see her work's impact on people. How do you think that works for her values aligning to her daily life,
Every
daily
day.
grind, right? So what about those of us who don't get to see our impact on the real world? It might be a harder slog, right? And so, an ask to people at the top would be, are all of your employees able to see the impact they're having? That what their work is actually doing for people, or the world, or the planet, or whatever it is, right? That's a real question. But without going too crazy, and we're over time, we would love for you to fill out an evaluation for us for our feedback, because we're trying to grow and be better. So if you don't mind taking 5 minutes, and
Sure.
thank you so much, and we'll see you all.
Thank you.
Oh, and I realized what I forgot to say when you guys were, is you can download this for a PDF fillable form. It was on the bottom of one of the slides.
We'll follow.
Yeah, I can
I'll
follow
send
it.
it.
It would say if you want it in non-paper form,